So, post-pandemic pedagogy. This is a subject I think that most of us who are academics have pondered over after the last year. And the focus in this talk is very much on history, but I think the implications and the resonance are possibly extending further. I should emphasise these are interim results from an ongoing pilot study which is being conducted with two colleagues, one at Lincoln, the other at Keele. So this pilot study is taking place as we speak in 6 East Midlands universities. Later this week, a version is going to be rolled out nationally, and talks are underway for international versions of the same survey. I'm also conducting a separate but related study on transition of history students from school to university in this era of COVID. And all of these studies are being done in cooperation with and with sponsorship from, in some cases, subject associations at a regional and national and international level. So, so far we've got just over 100 responses. 2/3 of them have been from undergraduates, and 2/3 of those undergraduates are first years. Just under a third of the staff of the total number of participants in the survey are staff. The remainder are made up of master's students, and you can see the demographic breakdown at the bottom of the screen. So one of the unusual aspects of this survey is that it has done the task of asking identical or near identical questions to both staff and students. You'll be aware that virtually every university I can think of has been surveying its students extensively about their experiences of teaching and learning under lockdown and and during the pandemic. Some universities have also been surveying staff, but what is rare is to have surveys which span several universities and specifically for the purposes of this project ask the same questions of staff and students, so we can get different perspectives on the same topics. Now, I say that they're identical or almost identical. In the case of first years, clearly first years have no pre-COVID experience of higher education, and so when we're asking second years and above, what I call advanced students, about comparing and contrasting their education before and during COVID, those questions clearly can't be asked of first years. This is a mixed method survey, so I'm gratified that the vast majority of people took some time to provide free text answers to open questions as well as ticking boxes. So in the first set of questions, what I was doing was asking staff and these advanced students in the second year and above to compare 13 aspects of teaching and learning before and after March 2020. And the bottom line for these, and again, apologies to Ellie, is that there is a sense of a worsening teaching and learning experience in almost every respect. All of these graphs aren't showing people who think things remain the same or people who didn't respond to the question or didn't know their response to the question. But in this case, as you can see, you've got, particularly in terms of students, a large proportion who, in fact, an absolute majority, who think that their own learning has worsened since the onset of COVID in March 2020. You can see similar trends, although less pronounced, when they're asked about teaching methods. Teacher-student interaction is unsurprisingly given very low marks for the period during COVID. Assessment, there's less of a there's less of a tendency to think things are worsening. In fact, for students, there's only a slight tendency in that direction, and a lot of people on that question think that things are roughly as before. There is only one question of these 13 where there was a plurality of people who thought things were getting better, and that was staff who thought that their feedback was superior under COVID than had been the case before. But the feedback from students on the feedback they were getting from staff wasn't so forgiving, and so they thought that feedback had deteriorated in that respect as in others. When we look at sort of net scores, so subtracting people who think that things are getting worse from people who think things are getting better, we can see that feedback is the area where staff and these advanced students in second year and above, there's the greatest disparity in their viewpoints. And these other three aspects below that also show strongly more pronounced negative responses from students, and that includes students' own learning. The next set of numbers, the disparity is slightly less pronounced, and in all of these cases, it's the staff who are more pessimistic. And then for the final three aspects, there isn't very much difference between staff and advanced student responses. Now, I've already mentioned that we can't ask first year students to compare the situation before and after COVID when it comes to learning and teaching in universities. Learning under COVID in university is the only higher education that they have experienced. However, what we did was we asked them instead to rate these 13 aspects of teaching and learning, and they did so on a Likert scale, which interestingly, and again I emphasize these are not directly comparable to the before after questions, but what's interesting is first of all that first year students are generally quite satisfied with their education. In fact, only one of these 13 aspects they are more likely to say their experience has been poor than has been good. And there are also particular areas where they are particularly satisfied, which contradict the areas where teaching staff and advanced students are most concerned. So in things like access to secondary sources, which you see as the last but one of these categories on the screen. Now, I mentioned that it was a mixed method survey. I mentioned that we've got free text responses. What I forgot to mention was that I've not really analysed these in any great detail, but the first year responses that you see here, which are fairly representative of what first years say about what they liked about teaching and learning, suggest that what they're doing is, although they've not been asked to do it, they're providing implicit comparisons between their experience at university and their experience at school. So some of the things that we take for granted of learning and teaching in university, like essay-based assessments, for example, in the quotation from in the middle, those things are the things that they like and don't have a sort of idea of whether those assessments were better or worse before COVID. OK, so the second section of the survey was asking people to then proceed to compare their experiences before COVID with their preferences for teaching practice after COVID. So what did they want to see after COVID? Did they want to have a continuation of what the kind of teaching changes that have been introduced since March 2020, or did they want to go back to this sort of status quo anti-pandemic. In the case of seminars, that was the case. They wanted to revert to what they had previously known, in other words, in-person teaching. And anybody who has spent the last year looking at screens like this can see the merits of that particular case. In terms of lectures, there wasn't the appetite to return to how things had been. So lectures of an in-person variety have been a mainstay of university education for the best part of 1,000 years. They survived the Black Death. I don't think that traditional lectures are going to survive the COVID pandemic intact. So you can see minorities of both staff and advanced students wishing to return to an in-person only experience. Now, on that, staff and advanced students were pretty united. Same does not go for the experience of assessment. So when they're asked about whether they want closed book exams, you can see that staff are less keen to go back to closed book exams than had been their experience of closed book exams before. However, in terms of advanced students, not a single student expressed a preference to go back to closed book exams. Okay, so this could be that, you know, if you give any student the chance to say, do you want to take an exam? It's kind of like asking, you know, turkeys to vote for Christmas. And so they would have said this irrespective of the pandemic. I think the difference is that they've got accustomed to not taking the traditional timed exam in an exam hall without notes, and this is going to be very hard to reinstate. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do for the purposes of this is to throw the first year numbers into the mix. So these are all looking at preferences after the pandemic. And what I'm trying to point out with these yellow arrows is that first years have the least enthusiasm for the most traditional of teaching methods. In other words, in-person lectures, seminars, supervisions. Okay, so they are the most radical, it seems, so far from these interim findings, these provisional results. They're also the least keen to have simply written feedback, and they're less keen than advanced students to conduct their independent study in libraries or on campus, although when it comes to exams, it's the advanced students who are the most resistant to any return to the traditional exam. So to conclude, well, the first conclusion is that these results so far are inconclusive in the sense that we've only surveyed 100 people, and the whole purpose of rolling this out nationally and internationally is to get multiple numbers of this of respondents, and therefore also be able to explore some things such as EDI issues, which so far are very difficult to do with the small numbers of minority students that we've so far been able to get to participate. Conclusion number one, however, is that people are overwhelmingly negative about their teaching and learning over the course of the last year or so. I think people are on the whole fairly forbearing and forgiving, understanding this is an emergency situation, but they don't think that they have just been able to adapt and learn as well as they're used to. The second thing is that I think there's no turning back. I don't think that if COVID was wiped out 100% tomorrow, there is the will amongst staff and students to return to how things were. I think we are living in pedagogical terms in a revolutionary moment. The third thing is, I think that some of these revolutionary changes will be divisive, because I think that they have done two things. I think that one is that there are different interests, different concerns being expressed by different groups, which are ultimately pretty irreconcilable. I mean, staff are wanting teaching to achieve some things that students aren't necessarily wanting the same. And I think that there is a real change in mentality amongst students, which comes at a time when student power is in a sort of 1968 moment.